Welcome and welcome back everyone to our University of Illinois Press Publishing Symposium. Once again, I'm Lori Matheson, Director of the University of Illinois Press, and I'm so pleased to have you all joining us. From getting it written, we now turn to getting it published. We hope in this panel to offer practical and timely suggestions, cautions, and advice about shaping a proposal, selecting a press, approaching an editor, and navigating the publishing process. Our goal here is to offer perspectives from the humanities as well as social sciences, and that breadth is reflected in the profiles of our distinguished panelists. I'd like first to introduce all three of our panelists, and then we'll get started with a round robin discussion. We will take questions throughout, so please, as you have questions, put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will field as many of them as we can. This session is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. And there is a link, Heather's posting a link to a portfolio of additional resources in the chat. Let me start with Debbie Gershenowitz. She's a senior acquisitions editor at the University of North Carolina Press. Prior to North Carolina, she held editorial positions at Cambridge University Press and New York University Press, among others. She acquires titles in African American history, the history of slavery, abolition, and freedom, histories of gender, women, and sexualities, histories of US foreign relations and America and the world, military history, Latinx history, and legal history. Emily Tabor is an acquisitions editor at the MIT Press. Emily has worked on the MIT Press Economics, Finance, and Business list since 2009, first as an assistant and now as acquisitions editor. Her particular areas of focus include micro and macroeconomics, computational and development economics, labor and health economics, regulation and political economy, environmental economies, game theory, and innovation. And she's currently interested in acquiring trade books about the future of work and the digital economy. Daniel Nassett is editor-in-chief at the University of Illinois Press. Danny has been on the Illinois staff since 2009, first as an assistant and then as an acquisitions and then senior acquisitions editor. Danny acquires titles in history, sports, American studies, communications and media studies, and Chicago politics. Recent series he has developed include the geopolitics of and studies in sports media. So I'm just going to dive right in with some questions here. And again, as you have questions yourselves, please put them into the Q&A and we'll incorporate them into the discussion as much as we can. So let's start with what advice our panelists might have for authors seeking to identify the right publisher and venue for their work. And maybe I'll ask Debbie to start off with that.
Thanks, Lori, for having us, and thanks, audience who I can't see, for being here later in the evening on a Thursday. I always tell people, sort of start with your own bookshelves. Like any retailer, we're selling a product and we base our expectations and our pricing and everything else on similar products that we have experience in selling. And also all publishers have niches. You heard Lori mention various things we all do. None of us do everything. And so what you want to do is try to look for patterns on your bookshelves, in your bibliographies, and you'll probably find patterns. There may be some presses that just come up over and over again, and others you may not. If you map that onto, if we can ever travel to conferences again, spend some time in the book exhibit if you can. If we don't travel again, a lot of presses have gotten really innovative in having digital exhibits during your major conferences. So, check out what you have in your own work in your bookshelves, and then sort of match that with what publishers may be exhibiting at the current moment. Lists can change over time, so a publisher might have been doing something 15 years ago that they're not doing now. So, but just remember that a publisher is likely interested in your project for similar reasons that you might see some connection with a publisher.
Great, thank you, Debbie. That's terrific. I also wonder, in terms of the right venue for a piece of work about, and Emily, maybe you can speak to this, about kind of getting a sense of whether a project that you're in conversation about is really a book project, or is it really a set of articles or an article?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that that's certainly something, that I come across a lot, particularly on the business list, sort of, is the idea robust enough to support a full-length book project? And so I find that it's particularly useful, to think about what's the work that you already have done. Is there enough kind of there? Or if you're embarking on kind of a new project, dig into it before you start, talking to a publisher, and make sure that there's enough to support a long-term project. I think that that's a key piece of it. I think that a lot of times it can be useful to try to get, an article published, and certainly journal article publication can be very long, and I think you may be able to publish a book faster than a journal article in some cases, but there are other ways that you can get sort of writing on a topic out there, particularly if you're interested in writing for a broader, more general audience. There's a lot of work that you can, do either in a blog post or a publication that's geared for non-academic audiences. And that would allow you to sort of kick the tires of your idea a little bit more, and see that there's something kind of worth getting into. I would say another thing to think about is, are you still excited about this? Because if you are, then there's probably more to it. If you feel like you've really kind of hit the bottom of the barrel, that's great time to move on to something else.
That's really great advice. I think you really can tell when an author has kind of a visceral commitment to a project and a need to tell that story, and when it's more of a, it's being driven by I just haven't got to get this dissertation published somehow. Great. I wonder what advice you might have for authors preparing a proposal. And maybe Danny, you can start us off with that.
Sure. I think, good presentation writing and keeping the audience front and center are good places to start. For me, I really like to see a clear answer to why this matters and to whom. The other elements should be there. Impact on your field, the research, methodology, but that so what question becomes the primary way that I'm going to sell the project internally to my colleagues and really get them excited about it. I think I know our marketing department really appreciates a realistic sense of audience, so don't hesitate to go into detail. Is there a course market? Does it have the potential to reach beyond your field? Is there a crossover market of educated readers? One individual element that I pay particular attention to, and kind of relates to the question Emily answered, is the annotated table of contents. I really like to see a narrative and argumentative arc that works across those chapters. So it really is a coherent book project and not just a collection of chapters. So I think, coming back to the first question as well, a clear fit with our list and topic and approach. And I think it's especially helpful if an author can make the case for targeting our press and connecting their project to our lists and our priorities as well. Appropriate length, both in the proposal and the book project itself. I think a proposal should be 10 to 20 pages is the range I would put it in. And then a book project, I guess, at least an academic monograph, things that expand much beyond 100,000 words are a challenge to publish affordably.
Thanks, Danny. That's great advice. Yeah, Debbie, go ahead. There, you did it.
I would just add also that, many publishers have guidelines on their websites for writing proposals. So, you're not necessarily starting blind. Look at the websites, and, also use, if you have a community, use them to take a look at your proposal, especially, those who have submitted a proposal and it was received well.
Thanks, that's great. Emily, do you have anything to add about?
Yeah, I would just say, sort of going off of what Debbie said, you know, there's definitely kind of a general style or format or kind of questions that every publisher looks for. So I, as an editor, don't care if you don't use the MIT Press proposal guidelines. It's absolutely fine to use sort of guidelines from another publisher as the starting point for your proposal. I would just make sure that you don't have that publisher's name anywhere on your proposal and make sure it's addressed to the right editor. Those are the kinds of things, they're obviously like simple mistakes, but that reflects a lack of care in preparing the proposal, and that makes it really easy to say no.
That's right, thank you. That's really great advice. We have a couple of proposal related chapters here. How much of, let me put these both out there. How much of a proposed book should an author write before submitting a proposal for the whole book? Steve Gutierrez offers that question. And a question from an anonymous attendee. When a proposal requires the introductory chapter as well as another chapter, do you have any tips on preparing those and what to include in terms of the additional chapter or of both chapters? Just advice about the whole proposal package, including sample chapters.
Should we maybe all three answer that? Because some of these questions, they're different perks. All right, so since I'm unmuted, I'll go first. The first question about when to submit a proposal, it's going to vary by press and sometimes also depending on project and the author stature. You know, some presses, and I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of this because it'll probably come up later. You know, some presses, they just want a proposal. They don't want to see anything else, and they may make a decision about a very advanced contract based on a proposal. Other publishers are going to want a couple of sample materials. I personally, for first books, I generally, if I have my druthers, I like to have a full manuscript because I'm a history editor, and many history dissertations, one way or another, will eventually become books, but a book is not a revised dissertation. So I know that lots of the people that I am dealing with have something like that. I don't want to see a full manuscript with the proposal, but I would like to know that if I'm interested based on the proposal, that within 6 months to a year, I might see a manuscript, you know, because that way I can file it in my like pay attention thing, or I can, if I know I'm going to be at a conference a month later, I will ask that person, hey, you're going to be there? Let's talk strategy when you're there. You know, if for books that are not first books, I will, you know, sometimes a proposal will suffice. If we're competing for projects, some publishers will compete, some won't. We may change what we require based on what the other publisher is doing. And maybe I'll let my colleagues answer the other questions.
I'd say my answers are pretty similar to Debbie's. I think for a first book, when you submit that formal proposal, it's nice to have a couple of sample chapters, or at least that point, to really get into the meat of the project. At Illinois, we sometimes do send out a proposal on sample chapters, even for a first book project, just to get some early feedback on it, you know, and make a commitment to the author and have the author make a commitment to us. For scholars who are coming back to us with second book projects, usually one sample chapter will suffice, but I still like to see a writing sample of some kind, usually at least a single chapter, just because before we offer contracts, we do seek peer reviews, and I feel like to get any real substance in that peer review, the peer readers are going to need at least a chapter.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. The feedback that you get from a sample chapter that's not the introduction is really the most constructive and helpful for you as an author when you're thinking about then how to keep going, developing the manuscript, because you know, without sample chapters, a lot of the feedback that we get from reviewers is just based on the proposal, and the proposal itself is very much, you know, I plan to, and so the feedback that we get from the reviewers is pretty speculative by design, and all I can really say is, well, this sounds like a good idea, and I think the author can deliver, and that's not super compelling to the publishing committees or, you know, whatever internal deliberating bodies we have to present proposals to in order to get approval to contracts. And so taking the time to prepare solid sample chapters, and you know, they don't have to be like 100% ready to go, but they should be like 90% ready to go, because this is going to reflect, you know, how your book is viewed initially, and sort of getting off on a strong footing is really a good idea. So I think it's, I think in my mind, I always am happy to wait for sample chapters. So if you know, send a proposal and I like it, or I'm like sort of not sure and I would need sample chapters to know, I'll ask for them, and I'm happy to wait. You know, it's not something where you have to like get them to me tomorrow, unless there's a competitive situation. But I would say definitely worth the investment to take the time to do those well.
Thanks, Emily. One thing that kind of brings to mind too is the question of how selective in terms of first books and revised dissertations do you have to be as an editor at this point?
Emily, do you want to take that?
Well, I was just going to say, as an economics editor, I don't really deal with a lot of revised dissertations at all. For economists to get tenure, it's what matters is usually writing journal articles. And so in my discipline, a lot of the books that I get are books from people who are either later in their career and sort of have a body of research that they want to present sort of a unified topic, you know, together, or they're books for general readers, and that's a completely different animal.
So on the flip side, in my discipline, it's a book discipline. And I have found in my long career that a lot of university presses in the humanities and social sciences, the soft social sciences, you know, we do a lot of first books. Until tenure requirements change, and they're not changing in some fields, you need to publish your first book with a university press. Also, again, in history, especially in American history, where I sign in, especially with race in America. Lately, authors are agenting up, which means that they're, you know, I'm just seeing a lot of second books and some first books that are going to agents that didn't used to do it, and commanding sometimes a lot of money for them. And in many ways, it's good for the authors. You know, they should, because they're underpaid. But I also find that, and I think part of it has to do with social media. You know, some academics are naturally good at it. This doesn't mean everybody is or should be, but especially when you're sort of trying to make a name and you want other people to notice you, you know, it's just changing the game. So consequently, I find that as a university press editor, I do a lot of first books, but within that, I am very selective, because my dream is to foster a long relationship with my authors and get their second book, and, you know, sort of not lose those or their third book to the trade, as I call it, because there are other things that matter as well. You know, relationships really matter, and that's what editors do best. So I do a lot, but I do them intentionally, and thinking about the long tail.
Thank you. Boy, that's really helpful. We have a couple of questions about, so we've been talking about kind of discipline specific requirements. A couple people have questions about authors who are writing books that cross disciplinary lines. How might that kind of an author look for a good fit with a publisher, or if there's an area that defies typical categories? How do you handle that? in terms of peer review, in terms of fit with your list, in terms of marketing. Danny, do you want to maybe talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think first there's a number of university presses who might intersect perfectly with an interdisciplinary project where they come at it from the exact same areas. And if you do that searching, you might find just the right press for that project. If not, then I think you have to kind of look at where your primary home might be. I mean, what conferences do you attend? Is that press there? That would be the right one to probably target for the project. I think with peer review, that's a really good question. When seeking peer reviews, we often ask the author for suggestions for readers, and for those kinds of projects, you have a frank conversation with the author about maybe their desire to have a peer reviewer come from both sides, from the two main fields that the project intersects with, and kind of as an editor, then we have two separate pools of readers who really want to find a reader to approach a project from each of those angles. So I think that's just clear communication with your editor, what you're looking for, and finding the right press. But I certainly think it's quite possible and feasible.
Thank you, Danny. That's really helpful. We have a couple of good questions about, since social media came up a second ago, of authors. Do you need to have a robust social media following to get published in academic presses? And then a related question, do you mean that writers who develop a social media presence can gain a reputation that will reflect well on getting a book published, or I would say also on the book itself once it is published? So how do social media networks kind of play into the author prospects?
I'll start with that because I basically opened up that can of worms. No to all of it. I mean, social media, or at least that's what I think. I mean, I think just like an author can only write the best book they can write if they're true to their voice. And when I say that, I mean that, some authors may really want to write a book for a general reader. I did environmental history for years, and I think 1 out of every 4 proposals I got, they said, I'm going to write this like Guns, Germs, and Steel. And I was like, yeah, no, you're not. And you know what? No, you shouldn't. Again, it's just disingenuous if you're, the impulse is understandable, but you need to do whatever makes you sing. And I apply that to the same with social media. I've had authors where it's just not a forum that they're comfortable with, or they may not have the time with, and it's a lot of work. And, some authors are so much better off and much more gratified spending that time advising students or in the archives or doing something, it is a full-time job. And only a few become, I don't know how many Twitter followers are in the room, but only if we become like a Kevin Cruz or like a journalist. So it doesn't hurt. I will say the benefit of it is that marketing is hard, and any publisher, even those publishers that have infinite marketing resources, we can't get at everyone who might cross your path. And social media can do that. Tout your book. It can help. It's not a requirement. And no, it's not going to get you a publishing contract. Your book is going to do that.
That's great.
I would just add to that, if you are hoping to write a book for a general audience, and not in the perhaps misguided, like this academic book is going to appeal to everyone sense, but a true book that is written, for a general readership, it does help to have a platform of some kind. That doesn't have to be social. It could be, I regularly speak on this topic to, on the business list that I work on, there are people who do a lot of corporate consulting and speaking gigs. That's a great platform. We can tie bulk sales to that. If you're someone who does a lot of, if you have a newsletter or, other things, it doesn't have to be Twitter. I think they're great conversations on Twitter, and I use Twitter as a resource for myself as an acquisitions editor to kind of stay on top of like what are the conversations in my discipline. I find that a really useful tool for finding potential authors and potential peer reviewers and things like that. And certainly authors who have a social media presence should use it to promote their books. If you don't have social media and your book is coming out next week, I don't know if it's worth it for you to like try to get on and you know, make that happen for yourself. It's a little bit more organic if you have a following, you're already kind of embedded in these community conversations, and then you can say, by the way, I have this book, instead of like spamming people with like my book. So I would say that if you're planning on writing a book for a wider audience, it is useful for some people in the world to know who you are and to be interested and excited in a book that you specifically write, not just interested on the topic. But how you go about developing that platform is not a one size fits all. It really is, you know, up to you to figure out what works for you.
Right. And maybe it has more to do with someone was asking if I develop a successful blog in my field, does that help my case for getting a book published? I think Debbie answered that. But it is a huge help in marketing the book eventually. Other thoughts about, oops, along this line? Oh, I just did something. For authors who are approaching an editor, so we've talked a bit about how to identify the right publisher. What questions should authors ask? And what questions should authors be prepared to answer? Danny, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. I mean, I feel like the questions to ask are really just demystifying the process, get a sense of what the publisher is looking for, what the timelines might be, what the process looks like, and what they're looking for from the author. I mean, it's the right time to, when you're seeking out that press and trying to create a relationship, you know, feel free to ask the editor all kinds of questions. I mean, that person will be your advocate, and so, you know, having a lot of faith in that relationship is pretty important from the beginning, and they should be quite willing to answer your questions. I feel like the questions an author might be prepared to answer are pretty basic ones. I mean, if it's an informal discussion before a proposal, we should have a clear sense of timeline for submitting that proposal, as well as the complete manuscript, just kind of getting a sense of the timeline for a project, as well as you know, what they think the audience is, those kinds of things. Those conversations don't need to delve too much into the content of the book. I really prefer the proposal and the chapters to do that work, but it's really about getting on the same page with processes and timelines.
I like to have, I don't need it, especially at a physical conference because they're crowded and rushed, but I notice if someone knows a little bit about the press, you know, like other books, you know, or, you know, kind of knows what we do. You know, you should definitely ask if you don't know. You know, like we don't do German history at the press, you know, and if you're not sure, ask. But I think an editor will appreciate it if you've done a little bit of homework. And because I do a fair amount of first books, I will also, you know, I get approached by graduate students. So first of all, I encourage graduate students to try to get to know editors, but, you know, you don't focus on finishing your dissertation. But if I'm talking to a graduate student, I'm definitely going to be interested in where they're doing their work, who their committee is. You know, I mean, a lot of us, because we are in various fields, you know, like we're going to know your advisor or who your mentors are. So I'm interested in that, who they're working with, you know, what models they use.
Great. Anything to add there, Emily?
I think to build a little bit on what Debbie said with those types of books that are their origins or dissertation, I mean, it's nice to, in those early discussions, for an author to have a pretty clear plan for revision, to really be able to lay that out in the conversation and differentiate what will be different about the book project as well.
And I would just add to that, I think for me, the most important thing for an author to be clear on is the audience for their book. You know, is this an academic book? Is it a book for scholars in one discipline? Is it a book for scholars in multiple disciplines? Or is it a book for general readers? Those are three distinct categories, and everyone is not an audience. And so an author who can articulate that, you know, as an editor, I can kind of read the proposal and read between the lines and kind of see like, okay, this is really who it's for. But having an author who understands and can articulate that point from the get-go is very reassuring to me as an editor.
Great. We have a question. We were going to get around to this, but this is phrased in a good way. Basically, how is the publishing dynamic for academics altered by the lack of physical conferences? How is the pandemic changing things? Emily, do you want to start with that one?
Sure, and this is actually something that I would be really curious to hear my colleagues answer, because I've had a couple of experiences of doing virtual conferences now, and that has been so wildly different from in-person conferences, and sort of the conversations that I would usually have at a conference haven't been happening in a virtual conference setting, the sort of like drop by the booth, like informal things. And so I think that's a real change. You know, there's always, you know, at a physical conference, people who you weren't on your radar stop by, ask a question, and suddenly you're like, oh, that's a really neat project. I'd love to hear more about it. And that sort of serendipity is lost. I think that there's also some benefit in the sense that you don't have to like cram everything into like 36 hours. And if it's better for everyone to have a phone call a month after the conference is over, like you can do that. And it's, you know, it's, but that said, I also find that the balance of, you know, work from home and caring for family at home, like if there's a conference, I'm not going to a conference on the weekend. Like that's just not possible the way it was when I could physically leave my small children behind and go. So I think that there's a lot of like real world stuff interacting with people's ability to participate in conference life and that way of kind of reaching out to publishers. And that's definitely, I think, the biggest impact that I've seen.
I do think there's something really lost with those informal conversations, and I feel like the people that it hurts most are first-time authors, because you have to be much more intentional with how you approach presses and really have your things together before you reach out to them. On the positive side, I think for me, it's decentered. The conference is kind of my primary mode of acquisitions. So I'm just doing acquisitions all the time and kind of organically building that into my schedule. And before COVID, I hated the phone and I hated Zoom calls, but I mean, this just kind of forced me to open up to that. And I feel for potential authors, I'm much more open to just sitting down and having a phone call than I would have been beforehand. So that's something to keep in mind, I think, when approaching potential editors.
Yeah, I agree with both. Like Danny, I hate the phone, you know, and I don't like sort of seeing myself, but, you know, that's changed all of that, you know. And like Emily, I have a family at home, and, you know, conferences for me were kind of the only time I could 100% immerse myself. And the adrenaline, you know, I mean, it was exhausting, but for me, I needed that adrenaline would keep me going, basically, like for the year. And the drive-bys, as I call them, you know, people you don't have a meeting with. It was wonderful. But you know, sort of riffing off of what Danny said, you know, while I do think on the one hand, it is hard for first-time authors, but I also feel like it's leveled the playing field a little bit, because so many young scholars, they don't have the resources to go to conferences. I mean, depending on your field, you know, registration is just not tenable, depending on where the conference is held. So because of that, actually, more than anything, I'm trying to make myself more available for virtual conferences. It's really hard, but you know, I try to sort of have office hours, you know, some other editors are doing that. And so, yeah, it's a mixed bag, but I do like there is a democratizing element there that was really lacking, and I think it was getting worse, and this sort of, that's the silver lining.
Yeah, I also find as an editor, it allows me to participate in other conferences that I never have been able to travel to before, and to see what's being presented and to make connections with authors who aren't necessarily on my regular circuit. So that's also a benefit, I think.
I'll just add very quickly, I just thought of this, you know, hard as it is for first-time scholars. I started the job I have now last November. I went to 2 conferences and then the pandemic hit. My heavy conference season is always the spring. And, you know, on the one hand, it didn't hurt me that much because I've been doing this for a long time and people know where to find me and I know where to find them. But I definitely felt like it was a harder first year because I was also new, you know, new just being at these conferences at this booth. So, you know, I think conferences do help in just sort of like connecting, like branding the editor and the press. And that's harder now.
Emily, do you have additional comments at all?
I think, you know, one thing, I think to Debbie's point about the kinds of people we're able to get to with virtual conferences is great. We saw one of the conferences that I went to shared some of the analytics on like what countries people were from, and it was amazing. You know, it was a conference that was based in Europe, you know, back when it was an in-person conference. And there was a lot of representation of people from South America that we probably would not have seen, you know, if people were flying. So that was really great. I do just want to, you know, sort of flag that there's been some research that shows that women are sort of getting, they're taking a little bit of a career hit in the pandemic, and that's something that I think we as editors need to be aware of. In the first 6 weeks or so of lockdown, the proposals that I was almost exclusively from men. And so I think that that's something that, you know, just to kind of be mindful of and be aware of, that there is this great sort of leveling the playing field in one sense, but there's another sense where that's the inverse is happening.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. And I had not heard that kind of data before, that kind of observation that that the demographics of proposals that you see really shifted then. That's really important to keep in mind. Kind of along the democratizing line, we have a request to about advice for independent scholars. Would you look at a submission by an independent scholar differently from a tenure track scholar or a not, you know, a scholar who's in the academy in some more contingent way?
For me, it does depend on the book. I mean, the short answer is yes. I've always published independent scholars wherever I've been, but it does depend on the book. If a book is a scholarly monograph that's really going to sort of make a theoretical intervention in a field, I don't usually look, you know, I want my author to be very immersed in the field on a somewhat narrow basis. So I have found that the independent scholars I've worked with, it's more trade or mid-list books. At UNC, and I think Illinois also does regional trade. You know, we have a big regional trade list that, you know, I mean, a lot of our money comes from that list, like cookbooks and birding books, you know, golf courses of North Carolina. You know, we have our regional trade list is almost all independent scholars, journalists, fishermen. It varies.
Danny, do you want to amplify anything about that?
I mean, it's very similar. I feel like that to consider a book project by an independent scholar, I'll always review a proposal and get a sense of it, but I think that most of those books that I proceed with are geared toward more of a general audience. I feel like in some ways the independent scholar has certain freedom in writing a book that a scholar might not have, and so it's nice to make the most of that in the way they craft the book and in their timelines. But I also think we're aware at Illinois that independent scholar might not have the financial and institutional resources that someone at an institution might as well. So we try to pay them a little bit more, or at least give them advance as well, or just kind of treat them a little bit differently.
Emily, is that kind of your experience at MIT?
Yeah, I would say, you know, as a university press, I'm always looking for books that engage with scholarship in some way, but it doesn't require the author to be an academic. It just, you know, and, you know, an independent scholar is still an academic, but I think that the, you know, for me, it's about the content of the book. It's about, can the author deliver on what they're saying, you know, they're going to do. So yeah, it really does just depend on the individual project. But as Danny and Debbie have said, if it's a book for more general readers, sometimes, you know, I don't do that many books with independent scholars. I do a lot more books with people who are not academics, that they are like business leaders or, you know, have some other role. So I do a lot more publishing with folks outside of academia entirely, rather than independent scholar as a category.
And how do those authors find you, or vice versa?
Sometimes they co-author with an academic. Sometimes they come to me through an agent. Sometimes they come in over the transom. But you know, it all depends. But again, you know, the decision is always going to be made based on, you know, is the project the thing that I'm looking for at the moment? Is it, you know, sort of meeting a quality standard? And do I think that this author is someone that can speak credibly to the issue?
Brandon Waddles would like to know more about the process and timeline after an editor has expressed interest in the proposal. Who would like to take that, kind of talk about the process?
I can do that a little bit. I think it really depends project to project and press to press. But once you deliver a formal proposal, we typically have that peer reviewed maybe by 2 or 3 readers. And in normal times, pre-COVID, I think we could expect reviews within a couple of months normally. Would ask the author to provide a formal response to the reviews, kind of lay out a plan for the full manuscript, and then turn to contracting. And then the timeline between that contract and delivering the full manuscript is once again back in the author's hands. I would say anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. Once we have the complete manuscript, that also needs to be peer reviewed. Hopefully, we can really build on the relationship we started at the proposal stage, and at least go back to one of the same readers. So you have a clear plan at the proposal. It's nice to follow through with that at the full manuscript stage. Reviews at that stage, probably ideally 2 to 3 months as well. In these times, that's much more challenging. After that, if the readers sign off on the project, we can move it into editorial design and production. If more revisions are needed, might work with the author one-on-one on those revisions. If the reviewers say it's not ready yet, we might have to go back to readers again. It really just depends on the project. Hopefully that's a somewhat satisfying answer.
Thanks, Danny. Are there any, does that pretty much match others' experience? Yeah, pretty standard experience. So a couple, one person asked, how much is profitability a factor when a press chooses to publish a book? And maybe along with that, we could talk about kind of routinely asking for subventions for books. Emily, you want to start with that?
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, as a university press, we're a nonprofit publisher. So, I think our standard is different than if we were a commercial publisher. We consider ourselves at the MIT Press to be a mission-driven publisher. That said, we do need to keep the, I think rarely do we make the decision to publish the book based on profitability. The decision of how we publish the book would be more driven by sort of the P&L, the profit and loss statement there. What price would we charge? Would it be hardcover? Would it be paperback? Those kinds of questions are where we get into the finances a bit. But if we think that this is a project that is going to make a scholarly contribution and that is going to be read and appreciated, even if only by a very small niche audience, then it's something that we would consider doing. For different kinds of books, for textbooks, for example, the amount of investment that goes into those is quite high. And so then we need to be sort of assured of a base level of, this many adoptions or, something like that, that there's an audience of sufficient size to make it worth the in-house resources that go into textbook development and promotion. But if we're just talking about a regular scholarly monograph, it's really about the quality of the work.
That's great, Emily.
Yeah, so we don't, well, subventions are a nice thing, I mean, I think very few publishers will turn one down, but we do not, I have worked at places where, as a matter of course, when a book is contracted, the director will send a letter out to every author with no pressure at all, but just saying, is that your institution may have a subvention fund for first-time authors, because it does benefit universities, the more published authors they have. So it's an ask. But that was only one place. Generally, I found that subventions have been requested or used really for highly designed books. And that even varies. I mean, if you're doing a book that is very image driven, I mean, a publisher will pay for that because they understand that is necessary to drive the text. But if you have some nice images and you really want them to be color, sometimes publishers won't consider that at all. But sometimes they'll say, well, yeah, here are the costs. Give us that. That's fine. Sure. We also, our press and some other presses, we have a small endowment. I say small because there are some presses that are heavily endowed. We are not, but we actually try to, we have a special endowment for first books that actually is called the Authors Fund. And authors who have published with us who then go on to publish again are given the option to donate some of the royalties for this thing called the Author Fund. So it's sort of like, what's the expression? Playing it forward or something? Playing it back?
Paying it forward.
Yeah, paying it forward. So we sort of try to find creative ways to help keep some costs down without exploding our budgets.
Right, thanks. I just wanted to mention to attendees that there's some really good suggestions in the chat about resources for revising dissertations and publishing first books. So you might just take a quick look at those. We have a couple minutes left, and we haven't really gotten around to the topic of revising a dissertation into a book, or so maybe I'll just we can do sort of a little lightning round here, and each of you give us just a couple, 2 or 3 kind of pieces of advice that you think are the most kind of the pithiest, most important things for authors to keep in mind if they're approaching that transition from dissertation to book. Debbie, you're nodding. Would you like to start?
Yeah. Ditch the literature review. And this is probably more for the humanities and social science people. That's for your committee, not for anyone else.
Emily? Oh, sorry, Danny. Danny wants to go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I will check the structure of your dissertation on ProQuest against the proposal I receive and see how different it is. The more different it is, the better. I mean, you shouldn't have the exact same chapter titles. It should be a thorough revision by the time you send it into a publisher.
I would say think about what questions you thought of while writing your dissertation and use that as the jumping off point for what your book is. Use the dissertation as like, here's the base of knowledge I have and I can draw from, but what else might I want to think about related to this topic? And that could be a way to get something that's really different from your dissertation, but still more suited for a book.
Any additional comments about that?
Yeah, I mean, if this is lightning round, like a lightning
Yeah,
round,
go. Let's do one more round.
You don't need so many examples to prove your point. You know, use the best ones, move on.
Danny, you have one more piece of advice you want to share?
Focus on what to keep. I mean, not what to cut.
Yeah. Emily?
And you don't have to prove yourself as much. I think writing a book, the author, like you're the author, the reader assumes you know what you're talking about. So you don't have to like show the math of how you can just like say a thing and like, you know, cite a source and move on.
Right, great. Great.
And own it, right? I mean, that's the thing. Like,
That's right.
You
It's
have
you're
the
the expert.
test and now own the book.
That's right. Well, this has been great. We're right at time, and I just want to express thanks so much to Debbie and Emily and Danny for this panel. Again, it will be made available on our YouTube channel after a while, as soon as we can get it edited and put up. But just thank you everyone for being here, and well, we hope to see you in another venue sometime soon. Thanks.